Get that woman off my street." Roy Puckett said it loud enough for the whole block to hear, loud enough for Eliza Mae Holloway to hear it from the wagon seat. 1,200 pounds of sugar beets piled behind her beet juice, running down the wagon boards in dark red streams. Her big hands wrapped around the reins so tight her knuckles had gone white. She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. She just kept driving straight through the center of Willow Creek, through the laughter, through the shouting, through every single person who had already decided she was finished. They had no idea she was just getting started. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell every week. I bring you stories of women who refused to quit when the whole world told them to. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. Now stay with me. Because what happened that February, nobody in Willow Creek Valley ever forgot it. Wyoming had a way of telling the truth about people, not gently, not kindly. The way the land told truth was the same way the winter came, without apology, without warning, and without any particular interest in whether you were ready. Eliza Mae Holloway had known that her whole life. She'd grown up on it, learned to read it the way other girls learned to read hymn books, carefully, seriously, because what it said mattered. And in the summer of 1887, the land was saying something that almost nobody else in Willow Creek Valley was listening to. Eliza was listening. But we'll get to that. First, there was the matter of her father's funeral, and the banker, and the debt, and the 14 cattle who were so thin you could count their ribs from the road. Thomas Holloway died on the 4th of June, a Tuesday, between breakfast and noon, in the bed he'd slept in for 31 years. He'd been sick since February, a lung sickness that the doctor in town called serious, and that Thomas himself called inconvenient, because there was always something that needed doing, and being sick was not on his list of things to make time for. He lasted longer than the doctor predicted. Eliza had nursed him through 4 months of it, running the farm in the mornings, sitting with him in the evenings, sleeping in the chair beside his bed when the nights got bad. When he finally went, she sat beside him for a long time without moving. Then she stood up, smoothed the blanket over his chest, and went outside to feed the cattle. Because the cattle still needed feeding. Because the land didn't stop, because a man died on it. Because that was something her father had taught her without ever saying it in so many words, that the work was the love, and you showed up for it, even when it cost you everything you had. She buried him 3 days later. 30 people came. 15 of them left before she'd finished thanking them. She was in Harold Voss's office the following week. Harold ran Willow Creek Savings and Loan from a mahogany desk that was too large for the room and a leather chair that creaked every time he shifted his weight. He was a man who had built his self-importance slowly and carefully, the way you build a stone wall, one piece at a time, each one selected to make the whole thing look more permanent than it actually was. He looked at Eliza across that desk, at the plain dark dress she hadn't had time to change out of since the burial, at the leather satchel she carried, at the directness of her eyes, and his expression arranged itself into something he probably believed was compassionate. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve that much given your circumstances." "All right," she said. "Your father was a good man." "He was," she agreed. "But the loan balance stands at $412. The interest has been compounding for 8 months. The property as assessed." "How long do I have?" Eliza said. Harold blinked. He hadn't expected to be interrupted. "I beg your pardon. Before proceedings begin, how long?" He shifted in his chair. It creaked. "1st of March, he said. "If the account isn't current by then—" "What does current mean exactly? The full 412 or the arrears?" Harold's expression tightened slightly. He was a man who liked to deliver bad news at his own pace. "The full balance, Miss Holloway, with 8 months of compounding interest that brings the total closer to $460. $460, she repeated. "Yes." "By March 1st. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Not with pleading, not with tears, with the flat measuring look of a woman doing arithmetic. "Thank you," she said. She picked up her satchel and stood. "I'll be in touch." Harold leaned forward. "Miss Holloway, I want you to understand that the most prudent course given the circumstances would be to consider, I understand the circumstances, she said pleasantly. Good day, Mr. Voss. She walked out of his office, down the steps of the savings and loan, and out into the full June sun of Willow Creek's Main Street. She made it to the wagon. She got up onto the seat. She picked up the reins. Then she put them back down and sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap and let herself feel it, the full weight of $460, and a farm with a broken barn, and 14 thin cattle, and a piece of land that hadn't turned a real profit in 3 years. She sat with it for about 2 minutes. Then she picked the reins back up and drove home. She cried on the road alone with nothing but the creak of the wagon and the wide open sky. Hard and ugly and honest, the way crying is when there's nobody watching. She let it run its course. And somewhere around the 3rd mile, the crying stopped, the way it does when the body decides it's done, and what was left behind, it wasn't despair. It was a question. What does this land actually have that I haven't seen yet? She'd been turning that question over since February, during the long evenings beside her father's bed. There wasn't much else to do while he slept, but think, and Eliza had always been a thinker. Her father said that about her since she was small, said it with a pride that other people sometimes mistook for criticism because they couldn't imagine what he meant. She didn't talk fast or move fast or fill up silence with noise the way some people needed to. She watched. She considered. She came to conclusions slowly and held them firmly once she had them. And what she'd been concluding over those long winter evenings was that the Holloway land was not bad land. It had been worked wrong. The southern pasture held moisture longer than it should for its position, which meant there was something in the soil worth understanding. The creek ran clean. The north fence line had natural windbreak from the tree line that nobody had ever thought to use properly. The land wasn't finished. It was just being asked the wrong questions. And then there was the sugar works. The Prairie Valley Sugar Works sat 25 miles east of Willow Creek, and every time Eliza drove past it on the road to town, she saw the same thing. Mountains of rejected beets piled outside the factory gates. Not small piles. Mountains. Dark, heavy, wet-smelling heaps of beets that the processing floor had spit out because they were too small or too damaged or too misshapen to be worth packing and selling. Every 2 weeks workers pitched another load over the fence. Every 2 weeks it sat there and rotted. Eliza had been watching those piles for 3 months, and she'd been reading agricultural papers, Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Records. Her father had kept a letter she'd written on impulse to a professor at the University of Wyoming, whose name she'd seen on a paper about winter feeding alternatives. The professor had written back. 2 pages, careful and precise, laying out what he knew about sugar beet pulp as a supplementary feed source. The nutritional value, the limitations, the mixing ratios that made it viable. She'd read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She knew what she wanted to do. She drove to the sugar works on a Monday morning in late June, hitched her horse at the gate, and asked for the foreman. Caleb Dunn came out from the processing floor, wiping his hands on a rag. Took one look at her, a big woman in a plain dress, no man beside her, a single-horsed wagon behind her, and arranged his face into the expression men used when they were deciding how much of their time something was going to be worth. "Help you," he said. "I'd like to take your rejected beets," Eliza said. He stopped wiping his hands. "Say that again." "The piles outside the gate, the ones you throw over the fence after processing. I want to load them and take them home." Caleb Dunn looked at her, looked at the wagon, looked back at her. "Those are waste," he said. "They're damaged. They're not—" "I know what they are," Eliza said. "I'm not planning to sell them. I'm planning to feed them." "To what?" "Cattle." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the quality of a man trying to decide whether he was being made a fool of. "You can't feed cattle on processed beet waste," Caleb said. "The sugar content alone, mixed with hay and dried grass at the right ratio. They'll winter fine," Eliza said. "I've done the reading, Mr. Dunn," he said. "Caleb Dunn. Mr. Dunn, I've talked to a professor at the university who has documented results. I'm not guessing at this." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the noise of the processing floor ran on the grinding and the steam and the low machinery rumble of a factory that didn't stop for conversations at the gate. A couple of workers had drifted toward the door to watch. "You'd load them yourself," Caleb said finally. "My men don't have time." "I know that. Take them as is, whatever condition they're in." "Understood. And if this goes wrong for you, it won't be your problem," she said. "It'll be mine." He studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it to satisfy him. "Tuesdays and Fridays," he said. "Come when you want, take what you can haul." He turned back toward the factory door. "Don't block the gate." Eliza was loading beets before he'd finished walking away. She had never loaded a full wagon of sugar beets before, and she learned in the first 20 minutes that it was the kind of work that had no patience for weakness, physical or otherwise. Each beet was dense and wet and heavier than it looked, and they didn't shovel cleanly like grain. They had to be lifted, placed stacked one at a time. The whole wagon built like a wall, hand over hand over hand, in the full June heat. Beet juice running dark down her wrists and soaking into the fabric at her cuffs. By the time the wagon was half full, her back was a long, steady protest. Her hands were raw, where the skin had rubbed against the rough skin of the beets. Her dress clung to her across the shoulders and down the back, heavy with sweat. She kept loading. That was the thing. People in Willow Creek had never understood about Eliza's size, had never given any thought to. They saw it as something that diminished her. Something that confirmed their picture of her as a woman who was too much of one thing and not enough of another. They never considered that a body built large was a body built to sustain. That the same frame that made her look slow in a parlor made her capable of doing what she was doing right now, hour after hour, beat after beat in the July heat without breaking. She loaded the wagon full. She climbed up onto the seat. She drove 25 miles home. She unloaded it into the corner of the barn building, the pile the way she'd planned beets first, then a layer of straw for insulation. Earth packed against the sides to hold the temperature. She finished in the dark. She fed the cattle. She ate a cold supper standing at the counter. She went to bed. She was back at the sugar works on Friday. By the time she'd made her third run, the town knew about it. Dorothea Phelps saw the wagon on a Tuesday and mentioned it to her husband before supper. By Thursday, it had made the rounds of the feed store, the barber shop, the saloon, and 3 separate kitchen tables in as many neighborhoods. By the end of July, everybody in Willow Creek Valley knew that Eliza Holloway was hauling loads of factory garbage home and piling it beside her barn, and the general opinion of this activity ranged from baffled to openly contemptuous. Roy Puckett held court on the subject one Thursday morning at the feed store counter. Roy was the biggest cattle operator in the valley. 500 head, 2,000 acres. A foreman named Gus, who did most of the actual work, while Roy did most of the actual talking. He was a wide, florid man who wore his authority the way he wore his hat pulled down low, covering everything underneath. "I've seen the pile," Roy announced to the 3 men at the counter. "It's enormous. She's got beets stacked 6 feet high beside that barn. You know what that tells me." "What's that, Roy?" said the counterman, who had heard Roy's opinions many times before, but had found it was easier to ask. "It tells me she's desperate," Roy said. "It tells me she's running out of ideas, and she's reached the point where a woman alone does what women alone always do. She's throwing everything at the wall to see if any of it sticks." He picked up his coffee. "It won't stick. Sugar factory waste isn't feed. It's garbage with delusions. Come February, those animals will be dead or sold off for nothing. That land will go to the bank, and everybody will have forgotten the name Eliza Holloway inside of 6 months." Nobody disagreed with him. Nobody had reason to disagree with him. Roy Puckett was wrong about many things in his life, but he was wrong about them with such confidence and consistency that people had come to mistake the confidence for knowledge. The day Eliza drove her 5th wagon load through the center of town was the day Roy said it to her face. She saw him coming from half a block away, the wide set of his shoulders, the hat brim, the way he walked into the middle of the street like it belonged to him, which in some practical sense it did. She kept the horses at their pace. "Holloway," he said, planting himself even with the wagon seat. "Mr. Puckett," she said. "You know people are talking." I'd imagine they are, she said. They're saying you've gone simple, he said. Not unkindly exactly. The way someone says a thing they believe to be true and have decided you deserve to hear. That you're so desperate to hold on to that land that you've lost the good sense to know when you're beat. Eliza kept her eyes on the road ahead. Her hands stayed easy on the reins. What do you think, Mr. Puckett? She said. He looked at the load behind her. I think you're working yourself half to death hauling beets that won't do what you think they'll do, and that come spring, you're going to be in worse shape than you're in now. That's possible, she said. He blinked. He'd expected an argument. He didn't quite know what to do with agreement. But, she said, you don't know what I know about this winter. Roy snorted. And what do you know about this winter? She looked at him, then directly for the first time, and she held his gaze for a moment before she clicked her tongue at the horses and let them carry her forward. You'll see, she said quietly. Come February. Roy stood in the road behind her and watched the wagon go. He said something after her. She could hear his voice, but not the words. She didn't turn to find out. The saloon men were worse because they had numbers and liquor and nothing in particular to lose. The first time it happened, she was on her 6th load passing the Lucky Star on a hot August afternoon. She heard the laughter before she even drew, even with the door, that particular kind of laughter, loose and loud, that men in groups produce when they've identified something they've agreed to find funny. There she is, came the shout. The beet queen. She held the reins steady. You gonna eat those yourself, honey? Whole lot of beets for one big woman. The laughter rolled. She heard it land on her like something physical, not pain exactly, more like the sensation of being looked at by people who couldn't see you. People who were looking at a shape they'd decided they understood, and calling it by a name that had nothing to do with who she actually was. She felt her hands tighten on the reins. She felt the breath move through her, slow and deliberate. She did not stop. She drove through the whole length of that block, with the laughter following her, and she kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she felt something harden in her chest that had nothing to do with bitterness. It was something cleaner than that, something closer to a decision being made permanent. She thought, remember this, not to punish them with later, not to hold over them, but to remember on the mornings when the back ache was too much and the money was too low and the February deadline felt too close, that these men had looked at her and seen nothing worth considering. That was information. That was fuel. The second time it happened, a man she didn't recognize stepped off the boardwalk and called something about her father. Something about how he'd died because he couldn't stand to see what his farm had come to, something so deliberately ugly that the men around him went briefly quiet, surprised even by their own. Eliza stopped the wagon. She turned and looked at the man directly. He was young, mid-20s, ruddy-faced, the look of someone who'd had 3 drinks by 2 in the afternoon and found it had made him brave. The street went quiet in that particular way. Streets go quiet when something is about to happen. Eliza looked at him for a long, still moment. My father, she said, her voice carrying clean and level in the quiet, worked that land for 31 years. He loved every acre of it, and he died knowing it was in good hands. She picked up the reins. I can't say the same for whoever raised you. She clicked to the horses. She drove away. Behind her, the street held its silence for another beat before the talking started again. She didn't hear what they said. She was already gone. She bought her first additional cattle the 2nd week of August. Pete Sargent was selling off what was left of a herd he'd spent 15 years building, and the look on his face when she came to look at the animals was the look of a man who'd made peace with a thing that had cost him everything. He walked her down the fence line without much conversation. He'd said all the things there were to say about it to himself already many times over, alone in the dark. These 3 are the worst of it, he said, stopping at a cluster of thin cows near the water trough. I wouldn't sell them to most people. It'd be a waste of their money. Why would you sell them to me? Eliza asked. Pete looked at her, looked at the cattle. Because you're going to look at them different than most people, he said. I can tell. Eliza walked the line slowly. She wasn't looking at condition. She already knew the condition. She was looking at bone. Frame depth. Hip angles. The things that spoke to what an animal was built like, underneath what a bad season had done to it. "This one," she said, stopping beside a big roan cow, hip bones riding high above her back. "She's the worst-looking one here," Pete said. "What's her breeding?" Pete was quiet for a moment. "Her grandmother was one of the best producers in this county, 20 years ago, maybe more." Eliza put her hand flat on the roan's neck. The cow turned her head and looked at her with a large, dark, exhausted eye. "I know," Eliza said softly, and she wasn't sure if she was talking to Pete, or to the cow, or to something else entirely. "I know. She bought 9 animals. She paid Pete a fair price, less than he'd hoped for, more than anyone else had offered, which she figured was the most honest transaction available to either of them. She drove them home slowly, the thin cattle moving with the careful wariness of animals that had been hurt and weren't sure yet if the herding was finished. Walter Grayson was waiting at her fence when she got back. Walter was 71 years old and had lived on the land beside hers for longer than she'd been alive. He was the kind of man who had become so much a part of the landscape that you could almost stop seeing him if you weren't paying attention, weathered and quiet and permanent as the fence posts themselves. He walked with a stick now, and his hearing had been going for 5 years, but his eyes were still the sharpest thing about him, and when he turned them on something, they didn't let go. He stood at the fence and studied the new cattle for a long time. "They're rough," he said. "They are," she agreed. "You got a plan for them. Beet pulp mixed with hay. Transition them off the fresh beet tops before the frost hits, then winter them on the dry mix." She paused. "I've been working out the ratios." Walter's eyebrows moved. "Not much, but enough." "Come inside," he said. "I've got something to show you." I had notes going back to 1874, cramped handwriting on paper that had gone yellow at the margins, the record of a winter when he'd kept a small herd alive on beet pulp when everything else had run out. He made her coffee so strong, it was almost a different substance entirely, and they sat at his kitchen table for 4 hours while the light changed outside the window, and he walked her through everything he'd learned, and everything he'd done wrong, and everything he'd do differently now. "Most people fight the land," he told her at some point in the 3rd hour, pushing a page of figures toward her. "They come at it with what they think it needs to be, and they push until something breaks, usually them. The ones who last are the ones who learn to see what's already being offered and figure out how to use it." "My father said something like that," Eliza said. "He didn't always manage it, but he tried." Walter nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "This will work," he said then. "What you're doing. The plan is sound. The beet supply is there, your storage method is right, and the animals you've chosen." He glanced toward the window in the direction of her farm. "They've got more left in them than they look, same as you." Eliza looked at the papers on the table. $460. March 1st. 17 cattle by the end of October if she bought the 3 she was still considering. A winter that everything she knew how to read was telling her would be the worst in recent memory. "Will you keep watching?" she asked. "Through the winter, if I have questions." "I'll be right there," Walter said, as if it had already been decided, as if it had never been in question. She left his house in the early dark and drove home with the wagon moving light beneath her and the first real cool of the autumn in the air. That particular cold that doesn't feel like threat yet, that still has September in it, but that carries a message underneath. She read the message. She'd been reading it since July. In the woolly bear caterpillars crossing the road with their coats almost entirely black. In the birds moving south 3 weeks ahead of their usual time. In the almanac her father had kept for 20 years, and the way the entries this year matched the entries from 1874. Walter's beet winter, the hard winter, the one that had broken ranches across the territory. She had written all of this down. She had put it beside the professor's letter and Walter's notes and her own feeding calculations and her stock projections, and she had looked at the whole picture, and the whole picture said the same thing in every language she knew how to read it. In the winter of 1887 was coming down hard. And it was coming down early. And almost nobody in Willow Creek Valley was ready for it. The 12th wagon load went into storage on a Wednesday in mid-October. Eliza stood beside the aisle, enormous now, running half the length of the barn wall, insulated and packed and sealed against the cold, and she put her hand against the straw and felt the warmth still held inside it. She had 17 cattle. She had feed for all of them. She had a plan that 3 months of reading and calculating and listening and hauling had built from the ground up. She had $460 to find before March 1st. Roy Puckett's voice came back. Everybody will have forgotten the name, Eliza Holloway. Inside of 6 months. And she held it in her mind for a moment, the way you hold a thing to feel the full weight of it. Then she set it down. She went inside. She lit the lamp. She did the evening feeding in the cold dark, each animal taking the beet mix with a steady patience that felt after 3 months like the beginning of something. Like trust being built one meal at a time. "All right," she said quietly to no one, and to all of them, and to the Wyoming night pressing cold against the barn walls. The first real snow came at the end of October. She stood at the barn door and watched it fall slow and unhurried and entirely sure of itself, and felt something settle in her chest that was not peace and was not fear. It was closer to readiness. It was the feeling of a woman who had done everything she could do and was now prepared to stand inside whatever came next. Out in Willow Creek, the ranchers looked at the sky and nodded to each other and said, "It was early, just a fluke, wouldn't amount to much." Eliza turned back into the barn. She had work to do. And February was coming. The snow that fell at the end of October was just the opening statement. November came in behind it like a man who'd made up his mind. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 3 days. The creek near Eliza's south pasture frosted at the edges. First, then thicker, until by the second week of November, it had gone quiet under a skin of ice that crunched when she walked across it on her morning checks. The sky stayed the color of an old pewter plate flat low, holding everything in. The kind of sky that didn't threaten. It simply informed. Eliza had been up before dawn every morning since the first snow. She had a routine now carved out of the dark hours, the way you carve anything useful by necessity, by repetition, by refusing to stop until it held its shape. She was at the barn by 5. She had the first feeding done by 6:30. She walked the herd before the light came fully up, checking legs, checking eyes, checking the way each animal moved through the cold. By 7, she was back inside, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, reviewing her feed calculations at the kitchen table. She had 17 cattle. She had enough beet mix by her numbers to carry all 17 through to mid-March. That was assuming an average winter. If the winter ran harder than average, which everything she'd read and everything she'd watched through the fall told her it would. She had recalculated for that too. She had a contingency. She had thought through the contingency's contingency. This was what Eliza did in the dark hours when other people slept. She planned. On the 14th of November, Walter Grayson came by in the early afternoon and stood at the fence with his stick planted in the frozen ground and watched her move through the herd. He watched for a long time without saying anything. Eliza had learned over the months of their friendship that Walter's silences meant something. They weren't the silences of a man with nothing to say, but the silences of a man measuring what he was seeing against what he knew. "They're filling out," he said finally. "5 of them are where I want them to be," she said. "The roan's still behind. I've been supplementing her separately." Walter looked at the roan, the big cow she'd bought from Pete Sargent, the one with the hip bones that had shown above her back like tent poles in August. The hip bones weren't visible anymore. The roan stood with a steadiness she hadn't had in October, her weight distributed evenly, her coat thicker, now her eyes clearer. "What are you adding?" Walter asked. "Extra beet tops in the morning. I held back 300 pounds of green tops in September, dried them myself, mixing them into her separate ration." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where'd you learn that?" "I worked it out," she said. He looked at her. "You worked it out yourself." The professor's letter said the tops had higher sugar and protein in the fresh state. I figured drying them would preserve most of that. I was right. Walter turned back to the roan. He was quiet for a long time. "Eliza," he said. "Yes. You're going to be all right." He said it simply. No dramatics. The way he said most things as a fact, he'd assessed and found solid. She felt something move through her chest at those words. Something she hadn't let herself feel in months, because there hadn't been room for it, because hope was a thing that cost energy, and she'd been spending her energy on other things. "Don't go soft on me now, Walter," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. He turned and made his way back toward his property, slow and deliberate with the stick. She watched him go, then turned back to her herd. The town, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the edges of something it hadn't prepared for. The first sign came in the second week of November, when Clem Hadley, who ran 200 head on the west side of the valley, drove into Willow Creek to put in an emergency order for hay. The order was twice his usual winter supply. The man at the feed store, whose name was Art Briggs, and who had a memory like a ledger book, noted this and asked Clem about it. "Just being careful," Clem said. Art noted the tone of a man who was not being careful, but who was beginning to be afraid. By the third week of November, he'd had 3 more ranchers come in with similar orders. Roy Puckett came in on a Tuesday with Gus, his foreman, and they stood at the counter for 40 minutes, discussing supply and prices and availability. And when they left, Roy's jaw was set in a way that Art had not seen on him before. Art told his wife about it that evening. His wife told Dorothea Phelps when she came in for dry goods the following morning. Dorothea Phelps thought of Eliza Holloway and her 12 wagon loads of beets, and felt something she couldn't quite name settle in her stomach. She drove out to the Holloway farm that same afternoon. Eliza was coming out of the barn when Dorothea's wagon turned up the lane. She stopped and watched it come, one hand resting on the barn door, her coat open despite the cold, because she'd been working, and the work had its own heat. "Dorothea," she said as the wagon pulled up. "Eliza." Dorothea climbed down. She was a woman of 52, with a practical face and sharp eyes that she sometimes tried to soften for social occasions, and never quite managed. She looked at the beet pile along the barn wall. She looked at the herd in the near pasture. She looked at Eliza. "They look good," she said, meaning the cattle. "They're getting there," Eliza said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving over the property with an inventory taker's habit. "Art says the ranchers are buying up hay," she said. "Says Clem Hadley came in looking like he'd seen something in the dark." "The winter signs have been saying this since August," Eliza said. "I've been watching them." Dorothea looked at her. "And you didn't say anything to anyone?" Eliza met her eyes steadily. "I said something to you in July," she said. "You asked me why I was driving to the sugar works instead of putting that time into the farm." Dorothea had the grace to look away. "I did," she said quietly. "You told me it sounded like desperation." "I know what I said." The silence between them had some weight to it. Not hostility, but the particular discomfort of a woman looking at her own earlier judgment and finding it wanting. "Are you going to be all right?" Dorothea asked. "Honestly." Eliza looked at her herd, looked at the beet pile, looked at the frozen ground and the flat pewter sky, and the way the south pasture even now held a little more color in the grass than the surrounding land. "I think so," she said. "Yes, I think so." Dorothea nodded. She climbed back up onto her wagon seat. She paused, reins in hand. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm sorry I called it desperation." "For what it's worth," Eliza replied, "it was. Just not the kind you meant." Dorothea drove away, and Eliza went back inside the barn, and the temperature dropped another 4 degrees before sundown. December arrived without ceremony and made itself at home. The snow that came with it was not the light, manageable snow of November. It was the heavy kind, the kind that fell straight down without wind and accumulated in a quiet that was more alarming than noise would have been. It came for 3 days without stopping. When it stopped, the valley was transformed. Fence lines buried to their second rails. The road into town reduced to a suggestion, the mountains gone completely behind a wall of white that pressed down on everything below it. Eliza had prepared for this. Her feed supply was under cover. Her storage system held. The beet pile insulated and packed. Walter had taught her, and the way she'd refined through her own 3 months of adjustment was intact. Temperature stable, no significant freezing, no fermentation, past the point of use. She had a path from the house to the barn that she cleared every morning, and she cleared it every morning without fail. Even the morning after the 3-day storm, when the new accumulation came to her hips and the clearing took 2 hours. The herd was calm. That was the thing that steadied her on the mornings when the work was almost too much, the steadiness of the animals. They had learned to trust the morning feeding. They came to the trough with a patience that felt to Eliza like a kind of faith. Like they had decided she was reliable and were willing to act on that decision. She did not take that lightly. She was back in the barn on the evening of December 9th when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the lane moving fast despite the snow. She set down the bucket she was carrying and went to the barn door. It was Pete Sargent. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him when he'd been selling off his herd with the face of a man making peace with a loss. He looked worse now, and it took her a moment to identify what had changed. Then she had it. He looked frightened. "Pete," she said. "Eliza." He pulled up his horse and swung down, and the movement was stiff, like a man who'd been in the cold too long. "I need to ask you something." "Come inside," she said. "You're half frozen." She put him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he wrapped both hands around it, and she waited, because Pete Sargent was not a man who said things before he was ready to say them, and pushing him wouldn't help. "I sold off 11 of my 12 animals in August," he said finally. "You took 9. I sold the other 2 to Clem Hadley." "I remember," she said. "I kept one, the old bull. I figured I'd winter him through and sell in spring." He stared at the coffee. "I didn't buy enough hay. I thought everybody said it was going to be a regular winter. I listened." He looked up at her. "I've got 6 weeks of feed at current consumption. Maybe 7 if I cut rations." Eliza was quiet. "I'm not asking for charity," Pete said. His voice was level, but she could hear what it was costing him to keep it that way. "I'm asking if you'd sell me a portion of your beet supply, whatever you can spare. I'll pay fair price." Eliza looked at her kitchen table. At the feed calculations she'd been working through that morning. At the columns of numbers that she'd checked and rechecked for 3 months. She thought for a long moment. "I can spare 200 pounds a week," she said. "Through February. That's what I can do without putting my own herd at risk." Pete exhaled slowly. 200 pounds, he said. "That'd do it. That'd keep him through." 40 cents per hundredweight, Eliza said. "That's what hay would cost you if you could find it right now, which you probably can't." "That's fair," he said immediately. "It's more than fair," she said. "It's what I need to keep the farm current. Don't feel bad about it." He looked at her for a moment. The relief on his face was the relief of a man who had driven out in the cold, not entirely sure he'd be helped, and had been helped anyway. "I shouldn't have told you those animals were worn out," he said suddenly. Eliza frowned slightly. When you came to look at them in August, I told you they were worn out. I was trying to warn you off. I didn't think you knew what you were doing, and I didn't want to be responsible for you making a bad buy." She understood. "You were trying to protect me." "I was being condescending," he said. "There's a difference." "A little of both, probably," she said. That startled a short laugh out of him. The first one she'd seen from him in a long time. He came back every Tuesday for the beet supply, and each Tuesday he stayed for coffee, and they talked about the winter and the cattle and the land, and Eliza understood that something was being built in those conversations that neither of them had named yet. The news about Eliza's beet supply moved through the valley, the way news always moved through small communities in winter, slowly at first, and then all at once. It was mid-December when Roy Puckett heard about Pete Sargent's arrangement. He heard it from Gus, his foreman, who had heard it from Pete himself, and the way Gus reported it told Eliza if she'd been there to see that even Gus was finding the whole situation more complicated than Roy's earlier pronouncements had allowed for. Roy came to her farm on a Thursday afternoon. She was at the beet pile when she heard his horse, and she stood and turned and watched him come up the lane on a good bay mare that he kept clipped and well fed, in a way that his cattle in Eliza's view might have benefited from instead. He pulled up and looked down at her from the saddle, and she could see him taking in the herd, the barn, the beet pile, the fact that everything was still standing, and still running, and still operational. 2 weeks into a December that had already sent 3 valley ranches into emergency mode. "Holloway," he said. "Mr. Puckett," she said. He dismounted. He was a big man, not her kind of big, the kind built for endurance, but the kind built from good food and self-satisfaction, which was a different thing entirely. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the beet pile. "That's a substantial amount of feed," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Sergeant says you sold him 200 pounds a week." "That's correct." "At 40 cents per hundredweight." "Also correct." Roy looked at her. Something was working behind his eyes. A calculation she recognized because she'd seen it in Harold Voss's office, in Caleb Dunn's face, at the factory gate, in every man who'd started a conversation with her, assuming they were dealing with someone they could manage. "I've got a feed deficit," he said. The words came out flat and deliberate, stripped of the usual Roy Puckett grandeur. "My foreman underestimated the consumption rate in this cold. I'm looking at a potential shortfall for 40 of my animals middle of February on." Eliza looked at him. She thought about the Thursday morning at the feed store counter. Garbage with delusions. Come February, everybody will have forgotten the name, Eliza Holloway. She thought about standing in the road while he told her she'd lost the sense to know when she was beat. She let herself think about it for exactly as long as it took to feel it and let it go. "How much of a shortfall?" she asked. Roy's jaw moved. "We're estimating 400 to 500 pounds a week through to mid-March." Eliza did the arithmetic in her head. Fast and clean, the way she did everything now, 3 months of calculations having sharpened the ability to a fine point. "I can do 300, she said. "Not 500. 300 at the same rate I'm charging Sergeant." "I need 500, Roy said. "I know what you need," she said. "I'm telling you what I can provide without compromising my own herd. 300 pounds, 60 cents a week at 40 per hundred. Take it or don't." Roy Puckett stood in front of Eliza Holloway's beet pile in the cold December afternoon and did the calculation she'd already done and arrived at the same place she had, which was that 300 pounds was better than nothing, and nothing was what he was going to find anywhere else in the valley at this point in the winter. "Fine," he said. "I'll need payment in advance," she said. "Weekly, cash or banknote." His eyes sharpened. "You don't trust my word." "I trust your word fine, Mr. Puckett," she said. "This is a business arrangement. Business arrangements run on advance payment. That's standard." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded banknote and held it out. She took it, checked it, folded it, and put it in her pocket. "Tuesdays," she said. "Same as Sergeant. I'll have your portion measured and set aside." Roy nodded. He gathered his reins. He mounted. I was halfway back down the lane when he stopped and turned. "Holloway," he said. She was already walking back toward the barn. She stopped. "You knew," he said. "It wasn't a question. Back in October when you said come February, you already knew." She looked at him across the distance between them. "Yes," she said. "How?" She considered the question honestly. "I listened," she said. "To the land, to Walter Grayson, to a professor at the university who wrote me back when I asked him a question." She paused. "To everything I'd been watching since February, when my father was still alive, and I had nothing to do in the evenings but think." Roy Puckett sat on his horse in the cold and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "I called you simple," he said. "You did," she agreed. "I didn't apologize." She hadn't expected him to not standing in a frozen lane with his pride still only half thawed. But the fact that he'd said it aloud, that he'd named what he'd done, was something. She nodded once and went back inside the barn. By Christmas, she had 4 paying arrangements. Pete Sargent, Roy Puckett, Clem Hadley, and a widow rancher named Clara Beets, who had 20 head and a feed situation that had gone critical in the second week of December. Clara had come to Eliza's door at 7 in the evening on a Friday night, and she was the only one of the 4 who had cried, and she was also the only one who had said plainly, "I should have paid attention when you drove those wagons through. I saw you and I thought..." And then she'd stopped. "I know what you thought," Eliza said. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Don't be sorry," Eliza said. "Be ready for the spring. That's worth more." She had taken on more than she'd originally planned. The additional sales pushed her own margin tighter than she would have liked, and she ran the numbers twice a day now, sometimes 3 times, checking and rechecking the balance between what she sold and what she kept. Walter came by every 4 or 5 days, and they sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the supply, and she showed him the numbers, and he looked at them with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything. "You're walking a narrow line," he said one evening in late December. "I know," she said. "If January comes in harder than December." "I've accounted for it," she said. "I built in a 15% buffer above my worst-case projection." He looked at her over the papers. "What's your worst case?" he asked. -20 for more than 2 weeks with snowfall above 18 inches total accumulation by the end of January. Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's not worst case," he said. "That happened in 74. My worst case would go further." "How much further?" he told her. She looked at the numbers. She picked up the pencil and started adjusting. It was January 3rd when the temperature went to -15 and stayed there. It sat at -15 for 11 days, which was 4 days longer than her worst case. Walter's worst case, the one she'd adjusted to after their conversation in December, and for those 11 days, Eliza operated on the kind of focus that narrows the world down to one thing at a time. The morning feeding. The afternoon check. The evening feeding. The numbers reviewed by lamplight. Sleep for 5 hours. Start again. She cut her own rations food-sleep time with the precision of a general managing a siege. She did not cut the cattle's rations by a single pound. On the 6th day of the cold snap, the roan cow went down. Eliza found her on this morning check, lying on her side in the back corner of the barn. Her breathing labored her legs moving in slow, weak cycles. The other animals had given her space in the particular way herd animals do when one of their own is in trouble. They'd moved away, but not too far clustered near the barn door, with their attention on her. Eliza dropped to her knees in the straw beside the roan. "No," she said. Not panicked, not pleading. Flat and firm the way you say a thing you mean to enforce. "No, you don't get to do this." She ran her hands over the cow's side, over her legs, checking for injury. No breaks. The breathing, now that she was closer, was labored, but not wet, not pneumonia, at least not yet. Cold stress. Possibly the feed adjustment she'd made 2 days ago, shaving the margins. She got up and went back to the feed supply. She measured out a larger portion than the adjusted ration, not the original amount, larger than that, and carried it back and held it near the roan's head. "Come on," she said quietly. "Come on now." The roan didn't move. Eliza sat in the straw beside her and put her hand on the cow's neck and stayed there. The barn was cold, in a way that had nothing abstract about it, that was a physical presence, a weight pressing through the walls. She could hear the wind outside, which had picked up in the last hour, and she could hear her other cattle shifting and breathing, and she could hear the roan's unsteady rhythm. She started talking. She wasn't sure why. She talked about the summer, about the beet loading, and the drive home, and the way the Wyoming sky looked in July at 6 in the evening when the light went golden and low. She talked about her father. She talked about the look on Pete Sargent's face when she'd put her hand on this cow's neck in August and said, "I know." She talked until the talking ran out, and she just sat there with her hand on the animal's neck, in the cold and the quiet. 20 minutes later, the roan raised her head. 30 minutes later, she was eating. Eliza sat back in the straw and pressed both hands over her face for a moment. Then she got up, refilled the water trough, and went back to the morning routine, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. She knew that. She knew it the way you know things that you don't have words for, yet something had been decided in the cold of that barn. Something between her and the winter and the 17 animals in her care that had nothing to do with dollars or deadlines or the opinions of Roy Puckett. She was not going to lose any of them. Not one. That was not a plan. Plans had contingencies, had flexibility built in, had acceptable losses factored into the worst-case math. This was something else. This was a promise made to herself in the language that mattered most to her, which was the language of work and will, and being there, the next morning without fail. The cold snap broke on January 14th. The temperature moved from -15 to +10 in the span of 36 hours, which in any other winter would have felt like a gift, but which Eliza recognized as a trap. The freeze-thaw cycle in January was harder on cattle than sustained cold, because it created conditions for joint stress and respiratory weakness that a steady temperature, even a brutal one, did not. She adjusted the feeding schedule. She added the dried beet tops she'd been holding in reserve for exactly this kind of swing. All 17 animals came through the cold snap. Every one of them. She did not let herself feel the relief of that until she'd done the full head count twice. Then she went into the house, sat at the kitchen table, put her head down on her arms, and let herself feel it. She allowed herself 2 full minutes. Then she picked up the pencil and started on the February projections. The valley outside was deep in the worst winter anyone under 60 could remember. The ranchers who'd bought her beet supply were keeping their heads above water, barely each Tuesday pickup becoming a kind of informal meeting. Pete Sargent, Roy Puckett, Clem Hadley, and sometimes Clara Bates standing in Eliza's yard with their bags of beet mix, talking in the low, careful tones of people who have been humbled by the same thing and have found an unexpected fellowship in it. Roy didn't say much. He never said much on Tuesdays, but he came himself every week rather than sending Gus, and there was something in that choice that Eliza chose not to examine too closely. It was during the 3rd Tuesday of January that Clem Hadley looked up from loading his portion and said, "Eliza, how many of your cattle you figure you'll have in the spring? Healthy and in condition?" "All 17, she said. He looked at her. "All 17. "That's my target," she said. "Roy's going to lose 8, Clem said, matter of fact. "Maybe 10, depending on February. He's got a few that are already too far gone." He paused. "My situation is better, but I figure I lose 3 or 4. He loaded the last of his portion. "You'll be the only one in the valley who comes out of this with a full, healthy herd." Eliza looked at him. "I know," she said. Not with satisfaction, not with pride exactly, with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had done the arithmetic a long time ago and was now simply watching the numbers prove themselves true. Clem looked at her for a long moment. "You planned for this," he said. "Not hoped for it. Planned for it, since last summer." "Since June," she said. He shook his head, not dismissively. The opposite the way a man shakes his head when he's confronting something he should have seen sooner and didn't. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me 60 cents, she said. "That's all." He laughed. It surprised both of them, a real laugh, the kind that comes out before you have time to decide whether you mean it. He paid his 60 cents and drove home through the January cold, and Eliza went back inside and checked the numbers for the day, and everything held. February was 10 days away. Harold Voss's deadline was 6 weeks after that. And 17 cattle stood in Eliza Mae Holloway's barn, eating their morning feed, surviving a winter that was breaking everyone else in the valley, every single one of them. February came in like a verdict, not like weather. Like a judgment that had been forming all winter, building pressure behind a closed door, and had finally decided it was done waiting. The first week of February dropped temperatures to -22. The second week brought 48 hours of continuous snowfall that buried the valley under another 19 inches and made the road into Willow Creek impassable for 3 full days. By the 8th of February, Roy Puckett had lost 6 cattle. He came to Eliza's farm on a Tuesday, same as always, same arrangement, but he came 2 hours early, which she'd never seen him do. And when she opened the barn door and saw his face, she understood immediately that something had broken in the night that wasn't weather. 6, he said without preamble. She didn't ask him to clarify. "Which ones?" 3 of the heifers from the north pasture, 2 older steers, the Angus bull I paid $400 for in September. He said it flat. Factual. The way men sometimes deliver information they can't yet afford to feel. "Gus found them this morning." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Roy," she said. "It's not your fault," he said quickly, too quickly, like a man who'd already considered whether it was, and had arrived at an answer he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I know it's not," she said. "I'm still sorry." He stood there in the barn doorway in the February cold, this wide, florid man who had built himself into the biggest cattle operation in the valley. And for a moment, he looked exactly like what he was. A man standing in the wreckage of a winter. He hadn't taken seriously enough trying to find the dignity in it. "I need more," he said. "Whatever you can spare above what we agreed. I've got 30 animals that are marginal right now, and if I lose the feed momentum on any of them—" "I can give you an extra 50 pounds a week," Eliza said. "Not more than that." He nodded. "What's the price?" "Same rate," she said. "But Roy—" She paused, and the pause was deliberate because what she was about to say mattered, and she wanted him to hear it clearly. 50 pounds extra is not going to save animals that are already too far gone. You need to make some decisions about which ones to concentrate the feed on, the strongest ones, the ones with the best chance. Roy looked at her. "Triage," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know that's not easy." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at his hands. "You know what's funny? I spent 30 years building that herd, selecting for the best stock, the strongest lines. And now you're telling me to decide which ones to save and which ones to let go." He looked up. "You ever have to do that?" She thought about the roan, about sitting in the straw at 6 in the morning with her hand on a sick cow's neck, talking to her about the Wyoming summer sky. "Almost," she said. "I almost had to." "What stopped you?" "I refused to," she said simply. Roy Puckett looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his feed portion and walked back to his wagon, and Eliza watched him go, and she thought that February had a way of teaching things that no other month could not, because it was cruel exactly, but because it was honest, and honesty at that temperature had a particular quality to it that no amount of summer comfort could replicate. The news about the valley's losses moved fast after that, the way bad news always moves in winter communities. Urgent hushed, spreading from kitchen to kitchen and barn to barn, with the particular velocity of information that everyone needed and nobody wanted. Clem Hadley lost 4 animals by the 10th of February. He came on Tuesday with his jaw tight and his eyes carrying the specific flatness of a man counting what remained. 4, he said when she asked. "Your strongest ones are holding," she said. "The ones you said would hold are holding," he said. He looked at her directly. "You told me in January which animals to concentrate on. I did it. Those are the ones that are still standing." She nodded. "The ones I didn't listen to you about," he said, "are the 4 I lost." There was nothing comfortable to say to that, so Eliza didn't try to find something comfortable. She just looked at him and let the truth of it stand between them without decoration. Clara Bates arrived at midday on the same Tuesday with her youngest son, a boy of about 16, who had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and who looked at Eliza's farm with the specific expression of someone seeing something they hadn't expected. "All still standing," Clara said, nodding toward the pasture. "All 17, Eliza said. Clara's son. She learned his name was Daniel, turned and looked at the herd in the pasture with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "How?" And Clara said before Eliza could answer, because she saw what was coming before any of us looked up from what we were doing. It was the first time anyone in the valley had said that plainly. As a fact, not as an accusation, and not as an afterthought, but as a plain acknowledgement of something that had been true since the summer. Eliza didn't respond to it directly. She measured out Clara's portion, and she helped Daniel load it onto the wagon, and when they drove away, she stood in her yard for a moment longer than she usually would have, feeling the weight of that sentence settle somewhere in her chest. She saw what was coming before any of us looked up. Yes, she thought. I did. She went back inside and checked the feed supply. It was on the 12th of February that the first stranger came. She was at the water trough when she heard the horse on the lane moving carefully over the packed snow, and she looked up and saw a man she didn't recognize. Well-dressed, riding alone, with the careful posture of a man who was paying attention to everything and filing it away. He pulled up at the fence and looked at the herd for a long time before he looked at her. "Miss Holloway," he said. "That's right," she said. "My name is Nathaniel Brooks." He reached into his coat and produced a card which he held out across the fence. "I'm a livestock inspector out of Cheyenne, Wyoming Stock Growers Association." Eliza wiped her hand on her coat and took the card. She read it. She looked up at him. "What can I do for you, Mr. Brooks?" she said. I've been making rounds through the valley, he said, assessing the winter losses, documenting the situation for the association's records. He nodded toward her herd. I was told I should come here last. Why last? She said. Because I was told this was the operation I needed to see after I'd seen everything else, he said. To understand what the contrast looked like. Eliza looked at him steadily. Who told you that? He paused. Roy Puckett, he said. She blinked. Once. Then she turned back to the water trough and finished what she'd been doing because the trough still needed filling and information needed time to settle before she responded to it. Roy Puckett had sent this man to her farm. Roy Puckett, who in October had stood in the road and told her she'd lost the sense to know when she was beat. Roy Puckett, who'd laughed at the feed store and called her beet supply garbage with delusions. Roy Puckett had looked at a Wyoming Stock Growers Association inspector and said, "Go see Eliza Holloway last, so you understand what the contrast looks like." She set down the water bucket. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you the numbers." Nathaniel Brooks sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. He was a methodical man, not cold, not warm, but precise in the way that certain professional men are precise, as if they'd trained the expressiveness out of themselves because it got in the way of accuracy. He had a notebook, and he filled it steadily, asking questions and writing the answers before she'd finished speaking, his handwriting small and controlled. He asked about the beet supply, the source, the quantity, the storage method, the cost. She showed him the storage structure beside the barn, walked him through the insulation method, explained the temperature management. He wrote it all down. He asked about the feeding ratios. She gave him the numbers, the base mix, the adjustments she'd made for individual animals, the supplementary dried beet tops she'd used for the roan, and 2 others during the cold snap. He asked about the additional sales to Sergeant Puckett, Hadley, and Beets. She showed him the records she'd kept, every transaction, every measurement, every payment, written in the same ledger book where she kept the farm accounts. He looked at the ledger for a long time. "You've been keeping these records since July," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since I started loading," she said. "I wanted documentation if anyone questioned the transactions." "Why would anyone question them?" She looked at him. "Because I'm a woman running a farm alone in Wyoming in 1887, Mr. Brooks. People find reasons to question transactions they didn't expect to happen." He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something move across his face, not quite surprise, not quite admiration, something more complicated than either. "Fair point," he said, and wrote something in the notebook. When they went back outside, he did a full inspection of the herd. He walked every animal, running his hands along their backs and sides, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd assessed thousands of cattle and could read their condition the way Eliza read the land. He didn't say anything for a long time. He came to the roan last. He stood in front of her and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her from the front, then the side, then walked around her slowly. "This animal was in Pete Sargent's herd," he said. "Yes," Eliza said. "I saw Sargent's records. She was listed as marginal in August, recommended for culling." He looked up. "That's association language for we suggested he put her down." Eliza said nothing. "She's the best animal in this herd," Nathaniel Brooks said. "I know," Eliza said. He looked at her then, and the precision was still there in his face, but something underneath it had shifted. "How did you know?" he asked, not skeptically, genuinely. The question of a man who had been doing this work for a long time and had just seen something he hadn't seen before. "I looked at her bones," Eliza said. "Not her condition, her frame. Who she was under what the season had done to her." Nathaniel Brooks wrote that down. He wrote it down carefully, and she had the feeling he was writing it exactly as she'd said it, not translating it into technical language because he understood that the words were the point. He closed the notebook. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I've inspected 14 operations in this valley over the past 10 days. I've documented 47 cattle losses with projections suggesting that number will reach 60 to 70 before the spring thaw." He looked at the herd. "You have 17 animals all in stable or improving condition in the worst February this territory has seen in 13 years. He paused. "I'm going to write a report." "All right," she said. It will go to the association in Cheyenne. It may also go to the Agricultural Extension Office at the university. He looked at her directly. Is that acceptable to you? You can write what's true, she said. That's always acceptable to me. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd set it. One more question, he said. Go ahead. The banker, Voss. I understand there's a loan situation. She looked at him steadily. There is. Is it current? It will be, she said, by March 1st. He looked at her for a moment. You're certain of that? Yes, she said, and the thing was, she was. She had run the numbers so many times that they'd stopped being numbers and started being something more like geography. A landscape she knew so well, she could navigate it in the dark. The feed sales to the 4 ranchers had brought in $47 so far. With February's remaining sales and the cattle she was projecting to sell in the spring. Healthy animals properly wintered in a market where healthy animals had just become the scarcest thing in the valley, she would clear the balance. She would clear it and have something left over. Not much, but something. Nathaniel Brooks left in the early afternoon, and she watched his horse move carefully back down the frozen lane, and she thought about Roy Puckett sending him here, and she thought about what that meant, and she decided it meant something she wasn't going to name yet because February wasn't finished, and she'd learned over the past 3 months that counting things before they were done was a way of tempting the winter to prove you wrong. She went back inside and checked the afternoon numbers. It was 3 days later, the 15th of February, when Harold Voss came. Not a letter. Not a note delivered by someone else. Harold Voss in person in his good coat and his good hat, driving himself out in a rented buggy because his usual driver wouldn't take the roads in this weather. And Harold had decided apparently that this particular errand required him to deliver it himself. Eliza was splitting wood when he pulled up. She heard the buggy and turned and watched him come, and she set the axe down against the woodpile and waited. Harold climbed down from the buggy with the careful movements of a man more accustomed to offices than farmyards in February. He looked at the herd. He looked at the barn. He looked at the beet supply, what remained of it still substantial, still insulated and packed and working. He looked at Eliza in her work coat, with her hands rough from the cold and the wood splitting, and something behind his eyes recalibrated. Miss Holloway, he said. Mr. Voss, she said. This is unexpected. I wanted to come myself, he said. Why? He cleared his throat. He had the look of a man who had practiced what he was going to say, and was finding the rehearsed version less adequate now that he was here. The association inspector filed a preliminary report, he said. I received a copy through the county agricultural office. Eliza waited. It describes your operation in some detail, Harold said. The feeding system, the cattle condition, the sales to other ranchers. He paused. It describes your operation as... He glanced down at what she assumed was the report folded in his coat pocket. As an example of adaptive agricultural management under extreme conditions. He looked up. Those are Brooks's words. I know what my operation is, Eliza said. I don't need a report to tell me. No, Harold said. I don't imagine you do. He shifted his weight. The ground was uneven under the snow, and he didn't have his footing, which Eliza thought was probably appropriate. I wanted to discuss the loan. The deadline is March 1st, she said. I'm aware. I know you're aware. He cleared his throat again. I wanted to discuss the possibility of an extension given. I don't need an extension, Eliza said. Harold blinked. I beg your pardon. I said I don't need an extension, Mr. Voss. I'll have the full balance with interest before March 1st. I told you that in June. I'm telling you again now. He stared at her. You have $463 with the compounding through January, she said. Yes, I have that figure. I've been carrying it since the day you told me. She looked at him steadily. I'll be in your office the week of the 24th, with the full amount. Harold Voss stood in Eliza Holloway's farmyard in the Wyoming February cold, and looked at her with an expression she found in a distant part of herself almost interesting. It was the expression of a man who had started a conversation holding all the cards, and had arrived at the end of it, holding none of them, and wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. That's... He stopped. Yes, he said. I'll have the paperwork ready. Good, she said. She picked up the axe. Was there anything else? He hesitated. The inspector's report, he said, recommends your feeding methodology for distribution through the Extension Office, as a model for other operations in the territory. Eliza kept her face neutral, though something in her chest moved at that. Something she wasn't going to examine right now, not in front of Harold Voss, not while she still had wood to split and an afternoon feeding to get to. That's the association's business, she said. Not mine. No, Harold said. But it reflects well on... It reflects on my cattle, she said, and on the land, which I intend to keep. She looked at him directly one more time, the same way she'd looked at him in his office in June, steadily, without pleading, without performance. Was there anything else, Mr. Voss? There wasn't. He drove away in his rented buggy, picking his way back down the lane, and Eliza split 4 more pieces of wood and stacked them against the wall, and then stood still for a moment, with her hands on the axe handle, the cold moving through her coat. She thought about June, about that office and that mahogany desk, and the $460 sitting between them like a wall. She thought about the road home, and the 10 minutes of crying, and the question that had come out of it. What does this land actually have that I haven't seen yet? She had her answer now. She went back inside. She had barely taken off her coat when she heard another horse on the lane. She looked out the window. Roy Puckett. He came in from the cold and stood in her kitchen the first time he'd been inside the house, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her kitchen table with its ledger books and its feed calculations and its pencil-worn margins, and he looked at her standing by the counter, and he said, "I heard Voss came out." "He did," she said. "What did he want?" "To offer me an extension on the loan," she said. Roy's eyes sharpened. "Did you take it?" "No." He absorbed that. "You're going to clear it?" "Yes." "By March." "By the 24th, she said. Roy turned his hat in his hands. She watched him. The big man, the biggest rancher in the valley, standing in her kitchen, with the hat going slowly around between his palms, working up to something. "I lost 8 cattle, he said finally. 8. I'll lose 2 more before the spring, maybe 3. My best bull gone. 6 heifers. I've been running this operation for 22 years. He stopped turning the hat. "You've been running yours for 8 months. "Yes," she said. "And you're going to come out of this winter with every animal alive." "That's my intention," she said. Roy Puckett looked at her for a long time. "Eliza," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed it, but didn't react to it. What do you want, Roy?" she said. "I want to know how you do it," he said. "Not the beets, not the storage method. I understand that now. I mean..." He stopped. He started again. "I've been watching you operate since August. I've watched you haul those wagons through town. I've watched you take every piece of mockery this valley had to offer and just keep working. I've watched you build something that the rest of us..." He stopped again. "Didn't think to build," she said quietly. "Didn't think to build," he repeated. "Because we didn't think you were capable of building it." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the February wind moved against the walls. "And now," she said. Roy put his hat back on. He straightened it carefully, the way a man does when he's reassembling his dignity piece by piece. "Now I think I was wrong about you," he said. "I think I was wrong about you since the beginning, and I think..." He paused. "I think I owe you a cleaner apology than I'm probably capable of giving." Eliza looked at him. She thought about the road in August. Get that woman off my street. She thought about the feed store and the saloon and the road home after Harold Voss's office in June. And she thought about 17 cattle standing in her pasture in negative 22 degrees, eating their morning feed alive. "You're here," she said. "Every Tuesday you come yourself. You could send Gus." She paused. "I noticed that." Roy was quiet. "That's enough of an apology for now," she said. "Come back in March. Bring Gus. I'll have something to show you." He nodded. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Brooks is going to publish that report," he said. "Through the association. It'll have your name on it. Your methods." He glanced back at her. "This time next year, people are going to know who you are." "I know who I am," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, and his face had the expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time that had been in front of him all along. Then he left. The door closed behind him, and the kitchen was quiet again, and Eliza stood at the counter and let the silence hold everything for a moment. Roy Puckett's hat turning in his hands. Nathaniel Brooks writing in his notebook. Harold Voss standing in the farmyard with his footing gone. Pete Sargent saying, "I was being condescending," and Clara Bates saying she saw what was coming before any of us looked up, and her father working the land for 31 years and dying knowing it was in good hands. She picked up the pencil. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger. She wrote at the top, March 1, final balance. And she started calculating what came next. Outside her 17 cattle stood in the February cold. Every one of them alive. Every one of them fed. And February, the month that had come in like a verdict, was not finished yet. But neither was Eliza Mae Holloway. The last week of February arrived the way the whole month had, without mercy and without apology. The snow had stopped by the 20th, but the cold stayed sitting over Willow Creek Valley like a man who'd been asked to leave and had decided he wasn't ready. The roads opened slowly, packed ice giving way to mud, giving way to something that could almost pass for a path if you didn't push your luck. People came out of their homes and their barns blinking at the pale winter light with the stunned expressions of survivors, which was exactly what they were. The valley had lost 61 cattle by the final count. Nathaniel Brooks released his preliminary numbers on the 21st, and the figure moved through Willow Creek in a single afternoon, landing in every kitchen and every barn and every conversation with the weight of something that had been survived but not yet understood. 61 animals. 3 ranch operations in serious financial jeopardy. 2 more that would likely not survive the spring without intervention. The worst single winter loss the territory had seen since 1874. And on one farm, 140 acres on the east side of the valley, a woman who had started the winter with 17 cattle, ended it with 17 cattle. Every one of them alive. Every one of them fed. The word spread. The losses had spread fast and unstoppable. The kind of information that attached itself to people and wouldn't let go because it demanded something from them. It demanded that they reconsider what they'd decided they knew. Eliza felt the shift before she could name it. It came in small things first. Art Briggs at the feed store, who had always been polite to her in the careful way men are polite to women. They don't quite know how to categorize. Stopped her on the 22nd when she came in for supplies and said without preamble, "Brooks's report has your name in it 3 times, I counted." "Is that right?" she said. "Front section, middle section, and the recommendations at the end," Art said. He looked at her over the counter with the expression of a man making a small but genuine correction. "I should have paid more attention in August, when you were buying beet supplies." He paused. "My wife said so at the time. I didn't listen." "Your wife sounds like a smart woman," Eliza said. "She is," Art said. "Smarter than me most days." He rang up her supplies without the usual hesitation. "I'll put you on account. Standing account, same as the big operators. You should have had that months ago." She took the supplies and walked out, and she stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the cold February air, and she felt the specific texture of that exchange. Small, practical, undramatic, and thought that this was how respect actually arrived most of the time. Not in a single large gesture, but in 1,000 small corrections, people quietly adjusting their behavior to match what they'd finally understood. She could live with that. She drove back to the farm and checked her herd and did the afternoon feeding, and that evening by lamplight she drafted the letter she'd been composing in her head since the 15th. It was addressed to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association in Cheyenne. It was 2 pages long. It proposed a formal pilot program, 6 farms, 2 seasons, documenting the use of industrial beet waste as supplementary winter feed across different herd sizes and pasture conditions. She cited Brooks's report. She cited the professor's letters. She cited Walter Grayson's records from 1874. She read it through twice. Then she folded it, addressed the envelope, and set it on the table to mail in the morning. Then she went to bed and slept for 7 hours straight, which was the longest she'd slept since October. She was in Harold Voss's office on the 24th. She wore the same dark dress she'd worn in June, washed and pressed, but the same one, and she carried the same leather satchel, and she sat down across from Harold Voss's mahogany desk, and opened the satchel, and set $463 on the desk in front of him. Cash and 2 banknotes. Everything accounted for the full balance with 8 months of compounding interest every cent of it. Harold looked at the money. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. "This is—" He stopped. "The full amount." $463, she said. "I'd like a receipt, please, itemized, showing the balance cleared." He picked up the money slowly. He counted it. He counted it again. He opened the drawer of his and removed a receipt book and began writing his pen, moving with the careful precision of a man who was doing a mechanical thing to give himself time to do an emotional thing, which was to come to terms with the fact that he'd been completely wrong. He handed her the receipt. She read it. She folded it and put it in the satchel. "The deed," she said. Harold reached into the desk drawer again and produced the property deed. Her father's name, crossed out her name, written in the lien notation, cleared and countersigned. He slid it across the desk. She looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. Thomas Holloway. Her father's name in the old ink, the handwriting of whoever had drafted the original deed in 1856. And below it, in Harold Voss's own hand, recent and clean, Eliza Mae Holloway. Free and clear. She put the deed in the satchel. "I'd like to discuss something else," she said. Harold, who had been beginning to assume the meeting was over, looked up. "I'm going to expand," she said. "Not immediately. Spring, maybe early summer. I'll need additional capital. 20 to 30 head of additional stock, another 100 acres, if the Garrett parcel comes available, and equipment upgrades to the barn." She paused. "I'd like to discuss terms." Harold Voss stared at her. You want a loan," he said. "Another loan." "A new loan," she said. "Under my own name with the farm as collateral at fair market interest." She looked at him steadily. "The farm that is now mine free and clear as of about 4 minutes ago." The silence in Harold Voss's office was the specific silence of a man watching the world rearrange itself around a fixed point he'd misjudged. Yes," he said. "Of course, we can discuss terms." He reached for a different form. His hand was slightly unsteady. "What time frame are you considering?" "Come see the farm first," she said. "Come in March after the spring thaw begins. See the herd, see the operation, then we'll talk numbers." That's entirely reasonable." She stood. She picked up her satchel. "Miss Holloway," Harold said. She stopped. "I told you in June that the farm would never survive another winter," he said. He said it slowly, choosing each word. "I want you to know that I was wrong. I made an assessment based on incomplete information and on assumptions I should not have made." He paused. "I am sorry for that." Eliza looked at him. How wasn't Roy Puckett turning his hat in his hands, working up to it slowly? Harold Voss was a different kind of man. Smaller in some ways, more careful, more practiced in the language of professional regret. But the words were real. She could hear the real in them underneath the formality. "Come see the farm in March," she said. "We'll call it even." She walked out of Willow Creek Savings and Loan and down the steps and into the street, and for a moment she just stood there in the cold February air with her satchel in her hand and the deed inside it, and $463 no longer weighing on her chest. A woman walking by on the boardwalk said, "Miss Holloway," with a nod that had something new in it. A man crossing the street tipped his hat. She walked to her wagon and climbed up and drove home. Walter was at the fence when she got back. She hadn't told him she was going into town today, but he was there, which meant someone had told him, which meant the valley was watching more closely than she'd realized. She got down from the wagon and walked over and stood beside him at the fence. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He nodded once. He looked at her cattle, all 17, moving through the pasture with the deliberate patience of animals that had been through something hard and had come out the other side of it. "Your father would have liked this," Walter said. She didn't answer right away. She stood beside him at the fence and let the words settle, let them find their place among everything else she was carrying. "He would have made a comment about it," she said finally. Something dry. Something that sounded like criticism and wasn't. Walter made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes," he said. "He would have." They stood together for a while without talking, which was something she'd come to understand was one of the specific gifts Walter Grayson offered, the ability to be in a silence that didn't ask anything of you. "The letter to the association," she said finally. "I sent it this morning." Walter turned and looked at her. "The proposal," she said. "For the pilot program. 6 farms, 2 seasons." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not stopping," he said. "No," she said. "Even now, even after." He gestured vaguely at everything: the paid debt, the cleared deed, the surviving herd, the whole long difficult winter she'd come out the other side of. "Even now," she said. "Especially now." Walter looked back at the cattle. "I'll write a letter too," he said, "supporting the proposal. My documentation from '74 and this winter both." He paused. "They'll take it more seriously with my name attached." "They'll take it seriously with mine," she said quietly. He looked at her. Something in his face settled, a kind of recognition, deep and unhurried. "Yes," he said. "They will." It was 2 days later, the 26th of February, when Roy Puckett came back. He came with Gus this time, as she'd told him to, and he came in the morning, which meant he'd cleared his schedule, which meant this visit was deliberate in a way that his other visits had been careful not to be. Eliza saw them from the barn and finished what she was doing before she went out to meet them. Gus was a lean, quiet man of about 40, who looked at things the way men look at things when they've spent decades actually doing the work, rather than directing it. He looked at the herd the way Eliza looked at things all the way through. "Ma'am," he said when she came out. "Gus," she said. Roy stood slightly back, which was unusual for him. He was letting Gus lead, and that told her something. It told her that Roy had brought Gus not to witness, but to evaluate, and that Roy trusted Gus's evaluation more than his own. "May I?" Gus said, nodding toward the pasture gate. "Go ahead," she said. Gus went in. He spent 20 minutes with the herd, a real 20 minutes systematic and thorough, working through each animal with the same kind of hands-on assessment Nathaniel Brooks had done, but slower, more personal. The way a working rancher does it versus the way an inspector does it. Roy stood beside Eliza at the fence and watched. "The roan," Roy said after a while. "Yes," Eliza said. "Brooks mentioned her in the report. Said she'd been recommended for culling in August. She was," Eliza said. Roy was quiet for a moment. "She's the best one, isn't she?" he said. "Not a question." "Ask Gus," she said. Gus came back to the fence. He stood on the other side for a moment, arms on the top rail, looking back at the herd. He had the expression of a man who'd been shown something that had changed the shape of what he thought he knew. "That roan cow," Gus said to Roy. "She'll drop a calf in April that'll be worth more than anything you've got coming this spring. I'd stake money on it." Roy looked at Eliza. She said nothing. "The whole herd," Gus continued. "Every animal is in better condition than anything I've seen come through a Wyoming February, and I've been through 17 of them." He paused. "The feed system works. The storage is sound. The selection method." He stopped and looked at Eliza directly. "You picked these animals for their frames." "Yes," she said. "Not their current condition. Their structure." "Yes." Gus nodded slowly. He looked at Roy. "She was right," he said simply. "About everything, start to finish." Roy absorbed this. Gus was not a man who said things for effect, and Roy knew it, and the words landed with the specific gravity of a judgment delivered by someone whose judgment Roy had trusted for 15 years. "I know," Roy said quietly. Then something happened that Eliza had not expected. Roy Puckett reached into his coat. He produced an envelope and held it out across the fence. She looked at it without taking it. "What is this?" she said. "Open it," he said. She took it. She opened it. Inside was a folded document, and when she unfolded it, she saw Roy Puckett's name at the top, and her name below it, and the words, "Deed of Transfer" in large letters across the center. She read it twice. She looked up. "The Garrett parcel," she said. 80 acres, Roy said. "The east portion which borders your south pasture. I bought it from Garrett in September as part of a larger deal that's since fallen through. I don't need it. It borders your land, not mine." He paused. "I'm selling it to you." "At what price?" she said carefully. "At what I paid for it," he said. "Which was fair market in September, which is less than fair market now since half the valley's been trying to survive a disaster, and land values in a disaster year go one of two ways." He paused again. "I'm not giving it to you. I want to be clear about that. This is a business transaction." "I understand," she said. "But the terms are generous," he said. "Because the previous terms I operated on—" He stopped. He looked at the fence post. He looked back at her. "Were not." Eliza held the document and looked at it and thought about 80 acres of land bordering her south pasture. The south pasture that held moisture that stayed green longer than it had any right to, that she'd been looking at since the summer and thinking about what it could become with more space attached to it. "I need to have this reviewed," she said, "by someone who knows land law." "Of course," Roy said. "And I'll need payment terms. I don't have the cash right now, not immediately after." "I'll carry the note," Roy said. 12 months. No interest." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has a shape to it, the shape of something large and unexpected, settling into a space that had previously been occupied by something else entirely. "Roy," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. Not suspiciously, genuinely. She wanted to understand the full architecture of what was being offered, and why. He looked at his hands on the fence rail. "Because Gus told me in August that I should look at what you were doing," he said. "He came home from the feed store after hearing about your beet supply, and he said, 'Roy, that woman might be onto something,' and I laughed at him." He paused. "I've been wrong twice this year about the same woman. First time I can maybe excuse. Second time there's only one way to correct it." He looked up. "This is me correcting it." Gus, who had been standing quietly through all of this, said nothing. But Eliza saw the slight adjustment in his expression, the look of a man whose judgment had been publicly validated after being publicly ignored, and who was choosing not to make anything of it. She respected that. "I'll have an answer for you by the end of the week," she said. Roy nodded. He picked up his reins. "One more thing," he said. He said it differently than the others, less resolved, more tentative, which was so unlike Roy Puckett that it caught her full attention. "Go ahead," she said. "The association's spring meeting," he said. "In Cheyenne, April. Brooks is presenting his winter report, and there's talk of opening a session on alternative feeding methods." He paused. "I think you should be there." "To present," she said. "To present," he said. "Your methods, your results, what you built here this winter." He paused again. "I'll sponsor your attendance. Travel, lodging, whatever it costs. No conditions." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "That's a significant offer," she said. "It's a significant story," he said. "People in this territory need to hear it. Not from Brooks. Not from the professor at the university. From you." He looked at her steadily. "From the woman who actually did it." She thought about the letter she'd sent to the association 2 days ago. The pilot program proposal. Her name on it. Her methods, her documentation. She thought about Nathaniel Brooks writing in his notebook carefully precisely the words exactly as she'd said them. She thought about her father. Not with grief, just with the specific warmth of remembering someone who had been exactly right about something important. "I'll go," she said. Roy nodded once. He and Gus rode back down the lane, and Eliza stood at the fence with the deed of transfer in her hands and the February wind moving around her. And she let herself think about 80 acres of new land, and a spring meeting in Cheyenne, and 17 cattle alive behind her in the pasture. She was still standing there when Pete Sargent's wagon turned up the lane. He'd been coming every Tuesday regular as the sunrise for the beet supply, but this wasn't Tuesday. This was a Thursday, and he was driving fast. And when he pulled up and got down, His face had the same look it had carried the first time he'd come to her door: urgency, and something underneath urgency that was harder to name. "I heard about the deed," he said. "Word moved fast in this valley." "News travels," she said. "I heard about Puckett's offer too," he said. "The Garrett parcel." She looked at him. "Gus talked to you?" "Gus talks to me," Pete confirmed. He looked at the document in her hands. "You're going to take it?" "I'm considering it," she said. "Take it," he said. "That land is the right land for what you're building. You know that already." She looked at him. "You drove out here on a Thursday to tell me to take the land deal." "No," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded letter. He held it out. She took it. She unfolded it. It was from a cattle buyer in Laramie, a man named Charles Whitfield, whose name she recognized from the association's membership records. The letter was addressed to Pete Sargent, but her name appeared in the second paragraph. She read that paragraph twice. "He wants to buy cattle," she said. "I wants to buy your cattle," Pete said. "Specifically. He's heard about the herd Brooks's report circulated in Laramie last week apparently. He wants first option on any animals you bring to market this spring." Eliza read the price Whitfield had named. She read it again. "That's 30% above current market," she said. "He knows what healthy animals are worth right now," Pete said. "In a valley that just lost 61 head, healthy animals with proper documentation are worth more than 30% above market. He's being conservative." Eliza folded the letter. She held it alongside the deed of transfer. She thought about June and the $460 and the 10 minutes of crying on the road and the question she'd asked herself, what does this land have that I haven't seen yet? She had the answer now. She'd had it for a while. But standing here with a buyer's letter in one hand and a deed of transfer in the other, with Roy Puckett's spring meeting offer and Harold Voss's loan discussion and Art Briggs's standing account, and all of it pressing into this one cold February afternoon, now she understood the full shape of the answer. It wasn't just the beets. It wasn't just the feeding system, or the winter calculation, or the cattle selection method, or any one thing she'd done. It was the willingness to see what was already there and work with it. To look at rejected beets and see feed. To look at thin cattle and see frames. To look at bad land and find the south pasture. To look at an impossible debt and see a 12-month problem, not a permanent one. That was what the land had. That was what she had. The ability to see what was already being offered and refuse to be told it wasn't there. "Tell Whitfield I'll be in touch," she said, "after I've looked at my spring numbers." Pete nodded. He took the letter back. He started to climb back onto his wagon, then stopped. "Eliza," he said. "Yes, my operation," he said. "I sold most of it off. I've got the one bull, some equipment, and a parcel of land I haven't decided what to do with yet." He looked at her carefully. "I've been thinking about starting again. Small. The right way." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd consider not a partnership exactly, more of a consultation arrangement. I pay you for advice on selection and feeding. I run my own operation, but I do it the way you'd do it." She looked at him. I was not a man who asked for help easily. She could see what it cost him in the careful steadiness he was maintaining, in the way he was holding himself very still while he waited for her answer. "Come see me in March," she said. "After the thaw. We'll walk the land together and talk through what makes sense." His face didn't change dramatically, but something in it relaxed, something that had been held at tension released. "March," he said. "I'll be here." He drove away, and Eliza went inside, and she sat at her kitchen table with the deed of transfer and the feed ledger and the letter to the association and all the accumulated paper of a winter that had cost her everything and given her back more than she'd known to ask for. She pulled the ledger toward her. She turned to the page she'd started on the 15th March 1st final balance. She added a new line below it. "Spring projection," she wrote. Then she started writing numbers. Not the numbers of a woman trying to survive. The numbers of a woman deciding what to build next. Outside. In the last week of February, the ice on the creek was beginning to thin at the edges. The valley was still cold, still hard, still marked by a winter that nobody in it would forget. But the light was different now. It had a quality to it that February light rarely carries, something forward-leaning, something that had more tomorrow in it than yesterday. Eliza wrote numbers until the lamp burned low. Then she trimmed the wick and banked the fire and went to bed. She slept straight through until dawn. In the morning she got up before the light and went to the barn and did the feeding, same as every morning, same as she'd done every morning since November. She carried the beet mix from storage. She filled the trough. She walked the line and checked each animal, the way she'd done 1,000 times now. Each check its own small prayer. Each healthy animal its own small answer. She came to the roan last. The big cow looked at her with the large dark eyes that had been exhausted in August and were something else now, not just healthy, but settled. Like an animal that had decided where it stood and was comfortable with the decision. Eliza put her hand flat on the roan's neck. "April," she said quietly. "Gus says April." The roan turned her head and regarded Eliza with a patience that felt in that cold early morning very close to wisdom. And from somewhere down the lane, far away, indistinct, but unmistakable, came the first sound of the season that was not winter. A meadowlark. One note, then silence. Then another. Eliza stood in her barn with her hand on her best cow's neck and listened to spring announcing itself at the edge of everything that had been survived. March was 6 days away. The reckoning was over. What came next was something else entirely. March came in quietly, not with drama, not with announcement. Just a gradual softening of everything that had been hard. The ice on the creek pulled back from the edges first, then thinner toward the center, then gone. The ground, which had been frozen solid since November, began to give slightly underfoot in the afternoons, that particular yielding that meant something was moving underneath, something waking up that had been waiting a long time. Eliza noticed all of it. She always noticed all of it. But March also brought something she hadn't fully prepared for, which was the specific weight of people's attention shifting direction. For 8 months, she had lived under the weight of being watched by people who expected her to fail. That weight had a texture she'd grown accustomed to, the sideways glances, the conversations that stopped when she walked in, the particular silence of people who had already decided what they were looking at and didn't need more information. That weight lifted in March. And what replaced it was heavier in a different way and took more getting used to. It started with strangers. The first one arrived on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, a rancher from the north end of the valley. She'd never met a man named Bill Archer, who had 200 acres and a modest herd, and who had survived the winter by selling off 11 animals in January at desperate prices to fund emergency hay. He came to her gate and took his hat off and introduced himself and said plainly, "I heard about your beet system. I want to understand it." She looked at him. "Come inside," she said. He sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. She showed him the storage method, the feeding ratios, the records she'd kept through the winter. She showed him the professor's letters and Walter's notes from 1874. She answered every question he asked and several he hadn't thought to ask yet. When he left, he shook her hand at the door, a firm 2-pump handshake, the kind you offer an equal. The next week, 3 more came. Then 5. By the 3rd week of March, Eliza had hosted 11 ranchers at her kitchen table, some from as far as 40 miles away. Word having traveled through the association network that Brooks's report was pointing to. She ran each conversation the same way, systematic, practical documentation. Forward, no unnecessary modesty, and no unnecessary performance. She showed them what she'd done, and why it worked, and what they'd need to replicate it, and what they shouldn't expect it to do. Walter came by on a Wednesday evening when she had the 4th group leaving her lane and stood at the fence watching them go. "You're running a school," he said. "I'm answering questions," she said. "Same thing," he said. He watched the last wagon disappear down the road. "You charging them?" "No," she said. He looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "Right now I'm building something. You don't charge for the foundation." Walter considered this. "Your father never thought small," he said. "Neither do you." He paused. "That's not a criticism." "I know it isn't," she said. Roy Puckett's deed of transfer had been reviewed, signed, and filed with the county clerk on the 9th of March. 80 acres east border adjoining her south pasture. Eliza had walked every inch of it the day after the paperwork cleared in the mud and the early March cold, and what she found confirmed what she'd suspected since summer. The soil quality was good. The drainage pattern fed into the same underground moisture system that made her south pasture hold its green. The land was not just more space. It was the right space. It completed something. She stood at the far edge of the new property and looked back at the farm. The barn, the house, the original 140 acres, and now this. And thought about Thomas Holloway, who had worked 140 acres for 31 years and never managed to make them fully sing because he hadn't found the combination that the land was waiting for. She thought she might have found it. She was still standing there when she heard hoofbeats on the new property's access trail and turned to see Gus coming at a quick pace, which was unusual for Gus, who did everything at the pace of a man who'd decided a long time ago that hurrying was mostly about anxiety rather than necessity. "Miss Holloway," he said, pulling up. "Gus," she said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. "Roy sent me. There's a man at your farm." She frowned. "What man?" "Whitfield," Gus said. "The buyer from Laramie. He didn't send a letter, just arrived. Roy's stalling him at your gate." She was already walking. Charles Whitfield was a tall, dry man in his 60s, who had the look of someone who had bought and sold enough cattle over enough years that he had stopped finding the process interesting and had started finding it simply reliable. He stood at Eliza's gate with Roy beside him and looked up when she came around the corner of the barn at a pace that was not quite running but was close. "Miss Holloway," Whitfield said. He extended his hand. "Charles Whitfield. I apologize for arriving without notice. I was passing through the territory, and I decided I'd rather see the operation than wait for correspondence." She shook his hand. "You read Brooks's report?" "I did," he said. "I also read your letter to the association, the pilot program proposal." He paused. "That's why I came in person rather than sending an agent." She looked at him. "The proposal isn't approved yet." "No," he said, "but it will be." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had been around the association long enough to know how these things moved. "I want first option on the results." "What do you mean first option on the results?" she said. "When the pilot program produces documented outcomes, and it will, the ranchers who implement your system will produce cattle I want to buy. I want an arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "Not exclusive. I'm not trying to corner you. But I want a formal relationship between my buying operation and your methodology." He paused. "And I want to buy your spring cattle. Today, if you'll negotiate." Roy Puckett, who had been standing slightly back in the careful way he'd adopted when he was at Eliza's farm present, but not leading, which was a significant adjustment for a man who had spent 22 years leading everywhere he went, said, "You should hear his number." Whitfield named a number. The barnyard went quiet. Eliza looked at Whitfield, then at Roy, then back at Whitfield. "That's 40% above March market," she said. "Yes," Whitfield said. "For which animals specifically?" "All 17, he said. "Full herd. I'll take the lot." She shook her head. "Not the roan." Whitfield tilted his head slightly. "The roan in Brooks's report." "Yes," she said. "She's not for sale. She's my breeding foundation. I'm keeping her." Whitfield looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man reassessing. "All right," he said. 16 animals, same price per head." Eliza did the arithmetic. She didn't do it on paper. She did it in her head, standing in her muddy barnyard in March, the same way she'd been doing arithmetic in her head since June, fast and clean and exact. The number she arrived at was not a number that solved everything. It was a number that changed everything. It covered the new loan she was discussing with Harold Voss. It covered the first payment on the Garrett parcel. It covered the operating costs through the summer and into fall. And it left a margin, not a large one, but a real one, that would let her begin the next phase without the specific terror of zero. "I want payment terms in writing before delivery," she said. "Naturally," Whitfield said. And the formal arrangement you mentioned, the relationship with the pilot program outcomes. I want that drafted by the association's legal office, not yours." Whitfield's expression shifted slightly, not offense, something closer to approval. "You've done this before," he said. "No," she said. "But I've read enough to know how it should be done." They shook hands on the terms that afternoon with Roy Puckett as witness, and Gus standing at the fence with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was satisfied about something and had decided not to show it too obviously. Whitfield left an hour later with a written agreement and a delivery date of April 15th, and Eliza stood in her yard with the signed copy in her hand and let herself feel it fully, without the armor of not yet and not until and wait until February. It was March. February was over. She'd made it. She sat on the porch step. She never sat on the porch step. There was always too much to do, and she sat there for 10 full minutes and let the March afternoon move around her, and she thought about every single day between June and now. She thought about the beet loading in the July heat, and the raw hands, and the 25 miles home. She thought about the saloon men, and the road, and Roy's voice in August. She thought about the roan going down in the January cold snap, and sitting in the straw at 6 in the morning, and talking about the Wyoming summer sky, because she didn't know what else to do. She thought about her father. She thought about him a lot these days, in a way that had changed quality since the debt had cleared. In the debt months, thinking about him had carried grief with it, the grief of his absence, the weight of the thing he'd left her. Now when she thought about him, it was different. Cleaner. More like conversation than mourning. She was still sitting there when Walter came around the corner of the barn. He saw her on the step, sitting still in the afternoon doing nothing, and he stopped and looked at her with an expression she recognized as genuine surprise. "Are you all right?" he said. "I sold 16 cattle to a Laramie buyer for 40% above market," she said. Walter stood very still. "Today," he said. "An hour ago," she said. He walked over and sat down beside her on the step. He was 71 years old, and he moved like it cost him something, and he sat heavily, and then he looked straight ahead at the barn and was quiet for a long moment. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. They sat together on the porch step in the March afternoon, the old man and the young woman side by side, not touching, not talking, just sitting in the specific companionship of two people who had been through something hard together and had come out the other side, and were now allowing themselves the time to understand what they were looking at. After a while, Walter said, "Your father came to me in the spring of 1884, when things were starting to go bad. He asked me if I thought the land was worth holding on to." Eliza turned and looked at him. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him the land was fine," Walter said. "That the problem wasn't the land. That the problem was," he paused, choosing carefully, "that he was fighting it instead of listening to it. And he said he knew that. He said he'd always known it. He just couldn't figure out how to stop." Eliza looked at the barn. "He was trying to teach me that," she said quietly. "All those years. He was trying to teach me the thing he couldn't do himself." "Yes," Walter said. "I think so." She was quiet for a moment. "He did teach me," she said. "Just not the way he planned." Walter nodded slowly. "No," he said. "Rarely the way we plan." They sat a while longer. Then Walter got up and said he had his own evening feeding to do, and she stood and walked with him to the fence, and they said goodnight in the way they'd been saying goodnight for months now, simply without ceremony, the way people say goodnight when they know they'll see each other tomorrow. She did the evening feeding. She checked each animal the way she always did, working through the lines slowly, a hand on each one. 15 would leave in April. 1 would stay. The roan stood at the end of the line and looked at her with those large dark eyes, and Eliza stood with her hand on the cow's neck and thought about April and what the roan's first calf would look like, and what the summer would bring, and what the next winter would require. She was already planning the next winter. She understood that about herself now. She was always planning forward. It wasn't anxiety, it was the way her mind worked, the way her father's had worked at its best, the way the land itself worked, always preparing underneath the surface for what the next season would ask of it. She went inside and wrote in the ledger until the lamp burned low. The association's spring meeting in Cheyenne was the 14th of April. Roy had arranged the travel a good hotel 2 nights the registration covered. He'd told her matter-of-factly, without sentiment, the same way he'd handled the Garrett parcel as a business correction, not a personal gesture, which was the language Roy Puckett spoke most fluently, and which she'd learned to hear for what it was. She almost didn't go. Not because she was afraid she wasn't, or at least the fear wasn't the kind that stopped her. It was more that April was a full month on the farm cattle delivery and spring planting, both falling in the same window, and the idea of leaving Walter alone with the roan and the calving season made her stomach tighten. Walter settled it on a Monday morning. "Go," he said, before she'd finished explaining the scheduling conflict. "The roan might drop the calf while I've delivered more calves than you've had winters," he said. "Go." She looked at him. "Go," he said again, more firmly. "This is the meeting you've been building toward since July. The letter you sent them, the proposal, the pilot program, all of it leads to Cheyenne. You don't skip Cheyenne." She went to Cheyenne. She wore a good dress, the best one she had, which was not expensive, but was well made, a dark blue wool that her mother had sewn, and that she'd kept for occasions that had never previously presented themselves in sufficient number to justify wearing it. She looked at herself in the mirror the morning of the meeting and saw a woman she was still getting used to, larger than most, quieter than most, with rough hands and a direct gaze, and the specific quality of someone who had been tested and had not broken. She thought, "This is what I look like." She went to the meeting. Nathaniel Brooks presented his winter report first. He was systematic and precise, and exactly what she'd expected him to be. And he presented her operation as the central case study, with a detail and accuracy that made her understand he'd been paying attention to everything from the moment he'd walked into her barn in February. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a man in the 3rd row raised his hand and said, "The woman in the report, Holloway, is she here?" Brooks looked at her across the room. "She is," he said. 40 heads turned. Eliza stood up. She was the biggest woman in the room by a considerable margin, and she was one of 3 women present at all, which was itself notable for a Wyoming Stock Growers Association meeting in 1887. She stood up and they looked at her, and she looked back at all of them, and she thought about Roy Puckett in August saying, "Get that woman off my street," and the saloon men and Harold Voss's mahogany desk. And then she let all of that go, because this room was not August, and these men were not the saloon, and she had driven 25 miles to the sugar works and loaded 12 wagon loads of beets by hand, and sat in the straw at 6 in the morning with a sick cow, and cleared $463 before March 1st, and she was not going to stand in a room in Cheyenne and be small. "Good morning," she said. Her voice carried. "I'm Eliza Holloway. I run a 140-acre operation in Willow Creek Valley. 17 cattle in, 17 cattle out. Ask me anything." The questions came for 40 minutes. Not polite questions. Real ones, the kind that come from men who had lost cattle this winter and were trying to understand why they had and she hadn't, and who were past the point of ego and into the territory of genuine need. She answered every question directly, without hedging, without the false modesty of a woman performing smallness for an audience that expected it. She cited her numbers. She cited Walter's 1874 records. She cited the professor's letters. She explained the storage system, and the feeding ratios, and the cattle selection method, and the winter sign reading, and the contingency planning. Halfway through, a man in the front row, older, heavy-set, the look of someone who had been in this industry for 40 years, put down his pen and just looked at her. When there was a pause in the questions, he said, "Miss Holloway, how old are you?" 28, she said. He nodded slowly. "I have been ranching since I was 16, he said. "And I want you to know that what you did this winter, the planning, the execution, the feed system, all of it, it's not just good for a woman alone on a small operation." He paused. "It's good. Full stop. It's better than what most of us did this winter, and most of us have been doing this a lot longer than 8 months." The room was quiet. Eliza looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Not deflecting it, not performing humility, just receiving it directly and cleanly the way you receive something that is being offered honestly. After the formal session, people came to talk to her individually, some curious, some skeptical, some wanting specific technical details. Some just wanting to look at her, she thought, because she was something they hadn't expected to see in a room like this, and they were trying to understand what that meant. One man younger, nervous with the look of someone who had inherited land and was not entirely sure he was equal to it, waited until almost everyone else had cleared out. He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and said, "I lost 40% of my herd this winter. I have until August before the bank takes the property." She looked at him. "Where's your land?" she said. He told her. "Is there an industrial operation within 30 miles, processing plant, mill, anything producing organic waste?" He thought for a moment. "There's a grain elevator," he said. "They dump the screenings, the chaff, the broken grain, mountains of it. Go home," she said. "Find out what they'll let you take for free. Write to me at this address." She pulled a card from her coat pocket. She'd had them printed in Cheyenne the day before her name, and the farm address, the first professional card she'd ever owned, and held it out. "I'll write back within 2 weeks. We'll work out the specifics." He took the card with both hands. "Why would you help me?" he said. She thought about that for a moment. "Because someone wrote me back when I was in your position," she said. "A professor I'd never met. He didn't know me. He just answered the question." She paused. "I can do the same." He looked at her card for a moment. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Yes." "I heard about you before today," he said. "From a rancher in your valley. Big man Loud, you'd know him." Roy Puckett, she thought. He said. The young man stopped. He was working up to something. He said that the biggest mistake he made last year was deciding he already knew what kind of woman you were before you'd had a chance to show him. He looked up. He said he tells everybody that now, like it's something he wants to make sure people understand. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Roy Puckett, telling people, like a lesson he was teaching himself out loud. "He's a quick learner," she said. "Considering." The young man smiled, brief, genuine. He put his hat back on and left. She took the train back to Willow Creek the next morning, and Roy met her at the station with his wagon, which she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, and which he offered with the straightforward practicality of a man who had decided that being useful was more honest than being sorry. "How'd it go?" he said as the wagon pulled out. "I'm going to need a larger kitchen table," she said. He looked at her. "For all the people who are going to come to it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The proposal," he said. "The pilot program." "Approved," she said. "Verbally pending the formal vote in May. Brooks is sponsoring it." 3 association members offered to co-sponsor before the session was over. Roy drove in silence for a while. Then he said, "I want to be one of the 6 farms." She looked at him. "The pilot program," he said. 6 farms, 2 seasons. I want to be one of them. I'll do it right this time. My whole operation, your methodology, full documentation. It'll require significant changes to how you manage your winter feed strategy," she said. "I know. And you'll have to take direction on cattle selection," she said. "Not from me personally necessarily, from the methodology, which means some of your selection decisions get questioned." "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "You're one of the 6. He nodded. He kept his eyes on the road. "Roy," she said. "Yes." "The young man at the meeting. The one you told about your mistake." Roy was quiet for a beat. "Word travels," he said. "It does," she said. "Why are you telling people that?" He thought about it. Genuinely, she could see not working up a performance, but actually thinking. "Because it's the most useful thing I've got to say right now," he said. "And because—" he paused. "Because I've been wrong before. I've been wrong about land, about cattle, about weather. I've been wrong and corrected and moved on and not thought much about it." He paused again. "This is the first time I've been wrong about a person in a way that cost someone else something. Not me. Her." He looked straight ahead down the road. "That's a different kind of wrong. Ought to be said out loud. Eliza held that. She held it the way you hold something you didn't expect to receive, carefully making sure you've got it before you try to put it anywhere. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and didn't say anything else, and they drove the rest of the way to the farm in the comfortable silence of two people who had figured out how to be honest with each other and had decided to keep doing it. Walter was at the fence when they pulled up. He took one look at her face and said, "It went well." "The roan," she said, climbing down. "Dropped a bull calf 2 days ago," he said. "Big, healthy, looks like his grandmother." She stopped walking. "Show me," she said. The calf was in the barn, tucked against his mother's side, with the solid, uncomplicated contentment of something that had arrived in the world exactly as it was supposed to. He was large for a calf his age, dark roan like his mother, with a frame that even at 2 days old said something about what he was going to become. Eliza stood in the barn doorway and looked at him for a long time. She thought about August. Thin cattle, bad land, broken barn. $463. A town full of people who had already written the end of her story. She thought about the question she'd asked herself on the road home from Harold Voss's office, crying in the wagon with the Wyoming sky above her. What does this land actually have that I haven't seen yet? She had her answer. She had it standing in the barn doorway in April, with a healthy calf against a healthy mother, and 80 new acres outside, and a pilot program approved in Cheyenne, and a kitchen table that was going to need to be larger. She had it in the form of everything that had always been there, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough and willing enough to see it. Walter came and stood beside her. "What are you going to name him?" he said. She looked at the calf for a long moment. "February," she said. Walter looked at her. Something moved through his face. Surprise, then understanding, then something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough. "February," he repeated. "Because that's when everything proved itself," she said. "And because I want to see that name every morning when I come in here and remember what it cost and what it was worth." She paused. "And because I don't ever want to be afraid of February again." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "That's right." She went home that evening and sat at her kitchen table, the too small table that was going to need to be replaced, and she opened the ledger to a fresh page. She wrote at the top, Year 2. Below it she wrote what the land is offering, and she started a new list. Not of debts, not of deficits, not of everything she needed to survive. A different kind of list, the kind you make when survival is no longer the question, and the question has become something larger and more worth asking. Outside in the April evening, the meadowlarks were back. Not one the way they'd been in February when the first one had announced itself at the edge of everything hard. Many now overlapping the specific layered sound of a season that has fully arrived and intends to stay. Eliza wrote until the lamp burned low. Then she closed the ledger and banked the fire and went to bed. In the morning she would get up before the light and go to the barn and do the feeding same as always. She would check on February same as she would check on all of them. She would walk the new 80 acres and think about what they needed and what they were already offering. She would write a letter to the young man from the meeting and start working out the specifics of his grain elevator situation. She would sit at the table with Walter and go through the pilot program documentation. She would do the work the way she had always done the work, not because someone was watching, not because she needed to prove something, not because the alternative was failure, because the work was the love. Her father had taught her that. She had finally learned it all the way through. And Eliza Mae Holloway, the big quiet woman from the old Holloway farm, the one everyone had already written off, the one who had hauled 12 wagon loads of garbage through the center of town, while the whole street laughed, had built something from everything they'd thrown away, including herself. That was what February had proved. That was what the land had been saying all along. And she had been the one out of everyone in Willow Creek Valley,